So I'm Jay DePass. I'm the director of the Public Health Applications Group at the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center at Carnegie Mellon, where modelers, software developers, and high-performance computing specialists apply high-performance computing resources to non-traditional applications in public health modeling. We're part of the MIDAS network, which is a collaborative network of research scientists who use computational, statistical, and mathematical models to understand infectious disease dynamics and help the nation to prepare for, detect, and respond to infectious disease threats. Specifically, the mission group is the outreach arm that connects MIDAS researchers to experts in diverse fields that can be pulled in to help the network of infectious disease modelers. So that's a short introduction of where I'm coming from, and with that I'll pass it off to Sean, who will introduce both his group at McGill and the webinar series in general, and then pass off to Lorette to introduce our speaker for today.
Great, thanks, Jay. Yes, my name is Sean Brown. I'm the Chief Software Architect of the C-Brain Project at the at the McGill Center for Integrative Neurosciences. I lead a team here of developers that try to bring high-performance computing to researchers for all sorts of areas of neuroscience. I'm also representing the Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives initiative, which is a multi-tens of million dollar project here at McGill University to bring informatics and infrastructure technology to a wide range of research topics in neuroscience, human behavior, neurodegenerative diseases, and genomics. I'm going to introduce our Bridge webinar series, which you've all been, thank you for joining us. The Bridge webinar series is a joint webinar series between our organizations, the Pittsburgh Supercomputing Center, the MIDAS Mission Network, the McGill Center for Convergence of Health and Economics, and the Healthy Brains for Healthy Lives initiatives, and the Johns Hopkins Global Obesity Prevention Center. And the webinar series is designed to prepare for the next generation of big data analytics woven into transdisciplinary and intersectoral sciences, policies, and innovation, and serving as a catalyst for solutions that scale to better address the seemingly intractable problems that lie at the nexus of health and wealth production, distribution, and consumption. Is a key to accelerate change lies in establishing bridges between sectorial big data and between data and content. And we've established a series to foster this real-time learning by bringing a number of speakers in from various and diverse backgrounds, just like today. And I wanted to let you know that we will be having our next webinar on February 12th at 11 a.m. where Dan Belsky from the Duke Social Science Research Institute will be giving a webinar on genetic discoveries for educational attainment and social class mobility. So we'll be very happy for you to join. You can register on the website, and we'll be sending out information about where the webinar link to go with. So with that, I will pass over to Lorette Dubé, Professor Dubé, who will introduce our speaker for today.
Thank you, Sean. My introduction will be very brief. I am James McGill Chair of Consumer and Lifestyle Psychology at the Desautels Faculty of Management, as well as the founding chair and scientific director of the McGill Center for the Convergence of Health and Economics, where essentially our work is all of the above in the sense of advancing the brain, the behavior, and the computational science in order to be able to train not just the computer science, but also the core action and training, research training in substantive domain as well. And in the context of behavioral change, we all know that it is this mixture of brain, behavior, and the environment that we are creating. So I'm extremely pleased to welcome Susan Michie for the presentation today on the Human Behavior Change Project, Behavior Science Meets Computer Science. as you will see, this is a fascinating initiative that culminates really on the pioneer role that Susan has played all over her career as a behavioral health psychologist, about finding ways to bring the science of behavior so that it is there to support action. So just a very brief introduction of Susan. She studied experimental psychology at Oxford, obtaining BA and PhD in developmental psychology. She is professor of health psychology and director of the Center for Behavioral Change at UCL. And this most recent foray in computer science is, in my view, one of the most innovative initiatives that is out there currently to see how we can bring the complexity science, the behavioral science, into Are you okay?
Hello, you cut off.
Oh yeah, it cut off there for a second, Lorette.
Okay, so I was just shifting to Susan.
Okay, thank you. Can everybody see my presentation all right?
Yeah.
Great, good. Well, I'm delighted to speak to you this morning your time, this afternoon my time, and to introduce the Human Behaviour Change project and give you some background as to where it came from. And I hope we'll have lots of time at the end to discuss it. So first of all, to acknowledge various funders and my 3 different research teams who have done a lot of the hard work that's led up to where we are and continuing to do the hard work. So I want to start off by talking about the challenges to increasing the effectiveness of behavioural interventions. I think we're all very aware that changing behaviour is absolutely key to addressing many of the global problems facing us, whether it is health, environmental sustainability, war and peace, etc. But the current record of developing effective behavioural interventions has been patchy, and we desperately need to find ways of developing more effective interventions. And I want to talk about a couple of the issues and problems about how we report our interventions and how we synthesize evidence to generate new insights about behaviour change, and leading into presenting my latest large project, the Human Behaviour Change project. So we have a rich source of theories and methods within behavioural science for intervention design and evaluation. There's considerable investment in interventions aimed at individual, community and population level, and we estimate something like hundreds of behaviour change intervention evaluations are published every day. So we have a huge and escalating amount of potential knowledge. But anybody who's looked at the literature, I'm sure will agree that most of these have modest and also very variable effects. So the question is, how can we improve on this situation? So if we're to improve interventions, we absolutely need to understand the reasons for this variance, and also to find ways of reducing the huge waste in research that currently is happening. So this requires better reporting of all aspects of interventions and their context, and the ability to both organise and synthesise large amounts of complex evidence at scale and rapidly, and secondly, to be able to make inferences from that evidence to generate new understanding. So I don't know if you're familiar with this series of the Lancet on reducing waste, headed by Paul Glasgow, Douglas Altman and other people. there was a series of about 5 or 6 articles. I highly recommend it. But a couple of the observations. 40 to 89% of interventions were judged to be non-replicable. I mean, we do not have a viable science if we can't replicate studies. And recommendations from the series included, there were many, many recommendations, but one was high quality and complete reporting for journals, authors and peer reviewers, and to use reporting guidelines. And why we need to do this is currently, when you look at the way behavioural interventions are reported, often the language is vague, the reporting's partial, and the terminology is inconsistent. So the same term might be used to mean different concepts, or the same concept is described using different terms. So here's just one example, the term behavioural counselling. And I've just taken 2 articles here. One of them is defined as educating patients about the benefits of lifestyle change, encouraging them, etc. Here's another definition: feedback on self-monitoring record, reinforcement, recommendations, etc. Now, it doesn't really matter which one you think is the better definition, but the problem is they're different. And so anybody who's trying to synthesize evidence is potentially just trying to put apples and pears together. And we're really, really missing a trick here by, really what is not good science. So we have to have terminology where we all know what we mean and we have a shared language. So the problems about this is that if we don't have shared and precise language, we're not only limited in our ability to replicate, which is the cornerstone of science, but also where we do find effective interventions, we're limited in our ability to implement them and limited in our potential for evaluating and improving interventions. So I'm sure, hopefully many of you are aware of the consort guidelines. There's a whole suite of these in terms of how to improve reporting. We have something called Tiger that was published in the BMJ, which is a template for describing interventions, which is very helpful. Then we have the Cochrane collaboration and their PICO ontology, which is stands for Population, Intervention, Comparator and Outcomes. These are all quite high levels, and what I'm going to present today started with some work that ended up with this, which is a taxonomy of behaviour change techniques for describing behavioural interventions themselves. And the reason I developed this work was when I was working as a consultant for our Department of Health. They asked us to answer some questions that were going to influence policy. And when I looked at the evidence, the published literature, in order to try and answer that question, the interventions were so heterogeneous and so poorly and inconsistently described, I thought we need to develop a language. And I began just bottom up, looking at what's the smallest component of those interventions that on their own could change behaviour, and came up with the concept of behaviour change techniques. What are these? They can be seen as the active ingredients within any intervention designed to change behaviour. They're discrete, low-level components that, as I said, have the potential to change behaviour, and they're observable and replicable. So with MRC, Medical Research Council funding, and the engagement of 400 experts from many different disciplines from 12 countries, we came up with a clearly labelled, well-defined, distinct and precise language that could be used with confidence by a range of disciplines and countries. This is hierarchically organised to improve ease of use and apply to an extensive range of behaviour change interventions. So we came up with 93 items, and we grouped them in 16 groupings by methods that you can read about if you're interested. So just to give an illustration here, the top left-hand box is goals and planning. That's the first of 16 groups. As you'll see, within that grouping, there are 9 different techniques. And these are just the labels you see, starting with goal setting for the behaviour, ending up with commitment. For every single one of these techniques, we have a definition, including how to distinguish it from other behaviour change techniques and examples of what we mean by them. Anybody who wants an easy reference, there's a smartphone app developed by an enthusiastic PhD student of mine, which is actually very handy because it has the definitions and the groupings of all 93. We've gone on to develop similar ontologies for the mode of delivery, so how the intervention is actually delivered, the mechanisms of action, the processes by which the change occurs, the target behaviour, the target population, and the intervention setting. And I'll say more about this later. What are the desirable qualities we want when we're developing such ontologies or taxonomies? We want clear definitions with non-overlapping terms without redundancy, well-organised hierarchical structures, comprehensive coverage of the area, and appropriate level of granularity in terms of how the information is represented in evaluation reports and in how people are likely to query the systems that we then build. So the guidelines I mentioned, the taxonomy I've shown you for behaviour change techniques, these can improve reporting and reduce waste in research, but on their own, they don't create new knowledge. So if we are to create new knowledge, we need the ability, as I said before, organise and synthesise large amounts of complex evidence at scale and rapidly, and make inferences from that evidence to generate new understanding. And I'll just mention here a second reason for me going down the road of what's become the Human Behaviour Change Project was sitting for 8 years on our national guideline development committee that was developing guidelines for public health in the UK. And from receiving a question that needed an answer from a government minister, to translating that into a researchable question, commissioning research groups to do the different kinds of systematic reviewing, including the economic evidence, considering the results of the systematic reviews that were produced, taking expert witness so that we could formulate recommendations that were fit for purpose, field testing those, etc. That timescale was about 2 years, by which time life has moved on and there's a whole new set of questions that people want answering. So it just seemed to me that that process, which goes on to this day all around the world, is really not fit for purpose because policymakers and practitioners can't get quick answers to the questions they want. The other issue, being in the UK, was that most of the research that we were considering was actually done in the US because there's a lot of research funding in the United States. But the context, the populations, the health systems are so very different than the ones we are wanting to make recommendations for, that this is another real big limit. And in fact, if we look globally, the areas where there's most health need, Africa for a start off, are the areas where there's least evidence. So this issue of being able to make useful inferences from what we do know to what we don't know is incredibly important for global health and indeed for addressing global questions more generally. So moving on now to the Human Behaviour Change Project. This is a Wellcome funded collaborative project. They've given us £3.7 million for 4 years to come up with a very ambitious set of objectives. I think this is going to be proof of principle because in that time there's a limit to what one can achieve. As you can see on the left-hand side, it's a collaboration of 3 different universities with also IBM Research who are based in Dublin. Our website, if you would like to sign on to it, and I should say that the website will be dramatically updated and changed within the next month, but do sign up for letters and alerts. So these are the people On the left-hand column, you see at the top the 4 behavioural science grant holders and the behavioural science researchers. The second column are our computer science team. Third column, our system architecture team. And at the foot, you'll see our project managers, administrator, and also consultants and PhD students. So we're a large team, and I should say that I am confident answering your questions about behavioural science. For the rest of it, less confident, but I have put the email addresses of the lead for computer science and for the system architecture, so that if my responses are inadequate in any way in these areas, you can follow up by email with them. Here's about half the team we managed to get together at our last study meeting. And we have the published study protocol in Implementation Science, which is an open access journal. And I would, if you look at this, do make sure you look at the supplementary files, which are the links at the foot of the article, because that's where most of the methodological detail resides. And we also have a paper on ontologies in the same journal. Okay, so the primary goal of behavioural science, I would say, is to develop an understanding of human behaviour to answer variants of what I'm calling the big question here, which is, for behaviour change interventions, what works, compared with what, for what behaviours, how well, for how long, with whom, in what setting, and why. Now, not everybody wants to ask every aspect of that question, but these are the kind of constraints that policymakers want to put on the kind of questions that they ask. So, I've mentioned some of the challenges, but just to summarise them here, we have a large diversity of research methods and topics, and I've talked about the inconsistency and incompleteness in reporting. This is where the ontology of behaviour change interventions comes in, which I shall talk about in a bit, for organising evidence. We have insufficient human resources given the increasing and accelerating volume of research and the need for timely knowledge. This is where the use of automated literature searching and study feature extraction comes in. And the research findings, again, I was very aware of this on the Guideline development group, often equivocal or contradictory findings that we didn't know what to do with, sparseness of findings relative to a variety of behaviours, interventions and contexts, as I mentioned before. And then we also have a real complexity of interactions between the components of interventions, aspects of the context within which the intervention is delivered, and the behaviours themselves. And this is where use of machine learning and reasoning algorithms for evidence synthesis and interpretation, building a knowledge system, comes in. So I'm going to be talking about a behaviour change intervention ontology, about artificial intelligence and machine learning, and the use of those for automatic extraction of information and for building a knowledge system that can be interrogated and continually improved as new evidence becomes available. So the big vision is that users will be able to get up to the minute answers to their questions. The other thing is even systematic reviews. Much of the evidence is many years ago, and a lot of the really up-to-date evidence doesn't feature in that, just by the nature of the process of how these things are done. Okay, so what we're going to do is create and evaluate a behaviour change intervention knowledge system. This is going to consist of the ontology of interventions and evaluation reports, a largely automated feature extraction system to read the behaviour change intervention evaluation reports using natural language processing. As we go on, this will become more and more automated. A behaviour change intervention database, which contains the information from those reports structured according to the ontology, and reasoning and machine learning algorithms that synthesize the information in response to user queries, and finally an interface, both for computers and human users to interact with the system. So that's all of that in 4 years. Okay, here's the roadmap of just our next couple of years that we've very high level sketched out. We have the evaluation reports on the left there. Then we've got the automatic extraction. We have the data extracted with the behavior change intervention ontology sitting up there. Then we have our analytics in terms of inference and recommendations from information extracted from the papers. So we're starting with searching and predicting, going on to recommending and explaining. Okay, so in terms of reasoning, these are types of analyses that are being explored at the moment. So if you look at the tops of the columns, we have search, describe, predict, recommend. Under search, we've got retrieval, finding the reports that are aligned with a given user scenario. Then descriptive, this is just what happened. Predictive, what could happen. So an outcome range prediction for a given experiment. And prediction of the effectiveness of a given scenario. So beginning to classify as well as regress. And then prescriptive, moving on to answering the question, what should be done? And this is where we get on to recommending interventions to policymakers. And in the notes from the computer scientist who sent this to me, I should say the last two columns is where we get on to the very interesting thing from my point of view, which is the explaining. The computer scientists who drew up this slide have got the following in their notes. Data mining, machine learning, optimization, dimensionality reduction, anomaly detection, association rule mining, sequential pattern mining, causal inference, metadata analysis on the fly for researchers, effective analysis of selected interventions for policymakers. Now, I have our bottom left-hand side of this slide has got the name and the email address of our IBM collaborator who's heading the computer science work. So anybody can follow up with him. Okay, so examples of human users. On the left we have our users. I've just taken two, a behavioral scientist and a public health policymaker. Obviously at the right hand we've got our knowledge system, but the kind of questions that they are likely to interrogate, or examples of the kind of questions they may pose to the system, for a behavioural scientist might be, what mechanisms of action are likely to count for the effect of X on Y? So this is a theoretical explanation kind of question. Whereas a policymaker may ask, for example, what do I need to do to bring about this change in this population? And there are tens, hundreds of variations of the big question which potential users might ask. Now, I've talked about ontologies a lot. Some of you will be very familiar with the concept, others less so. And it's used in philosophy, but in information science, it's a system for representing knowledge in a particular form. So the form is diagrammatically here, or a set of unique identifiers of entities, labels and definitions for these entities, and specification of the relationships between them. So the relationships may be either, part of, positively influences, etc. Now here's a mini-ontology for the sake of illustrating it more concretely. At the bottom you have here a behaviour change intervention. And this intervention that is going to try and bring about smoking cessation has part of it is the behaviour change technique of distraction. Now, how does distraction work? It influences negatively craving, and craving influences negatively smoking abstinence. So this is how distraction works. So distraction positively influences smoking abstinence, which is a type of the behaviour we're trying to change. Okay, so what can ontologies do? They can improve the clarity of thinking and reporting. They can generate new ideas and testable hypotheses. They can identify information gaps and promote lateral thinking. So some people think that ontologies are very reductionist and deterministic and undermine creativity, but I think the opposite is true. It also facilitates interoperability across domains of knowledge and knowledge representations, and provides a powerful and intuitive basis for automated querying and reasoning. And there's a whole world of ontologies that over the last 2 or 3 years I've begun only to scratch the surface of, but we have ontologists, consultants on our team who are incredibly helpful in developing this work. So what's the purpose of the behaviour change intervention ontology? This is to provide a formal system for representing information about behaviour change scenarios and their evaluations in a database that can be used for searching, for effect size prediction, and for model construction and modification. And these are steps very general steps we're using. So first of all, for each of these, we establish the domain and scope. We identify entity types and relationship types that need to be represented, and we do this from research reports, from models of behaviour change. We go out to experts also to get their input, decide on labels and definitions, establish the relationships between the entity types, and then we test against applicability, usability, and comprehensiveness with panels of behaviour change experts, public health experts, ontology experts, and then iteratively modify this until the consensus is that this is good enough to run with. General domain, as I said, is behaviour change interventions and their evaluations. And to begin with, the scope is smoking cessation we're taking. Currently, we're just doing RCTs, but we will expand that over time to include a wide variety of study types. Now, here is our top-level behaviour change intervention ontology. So, bottom left-hand corner, we have the intervention. And as you can see, that's made up of the content of the intervention. Those are the behaviour change techniques, the active ingredients that I showed you in a little bit of detail earlier on, and also the delivery, who's delivered, the mode of delivery, etc. That intervention influences behaviour via one or more mechanisms of action. However, the extent to which the intervention has that impact on the mechanisms of action will depend on the exposure of the population to the intervention. So this is both the reach of the intervention and the engagement of the population with the intervention. So this is a modifying influence. Another absolutely key modifier is the context. So the extent to which the intervention is associated with these mechanisms of action, and those mechanisms of action do have that influence on behaviour, will very much depend on what's the population and what's the setting. And in order to understand the effect of an intervention on outcome, you need to put all of these different top-level entities together, and here are schematic causal relationships between them. Now, we call this one scenario because I'm now going to go on and show a more elaborated version of the ontology, which includes the scenario, but also includes the way in which the data is generated. And it will become obvious why we call this a scenario. So here it is. If for the moment you just look at the right-hand side, everything in blue, and here we have the behaviour change intervention scenario, which is a triangle I just showed you. For any study, there will be 2 or more scenarios. So you can think of those as experimental conditions. There may be one intervention that is very intensive, has a lot going on in it, another which is a minimal intervention, another which is called a control, but in our experience, and Marijn de Bruin in the UK has done some fantastic work showing that the conditions or the scenarios that are labelled control often have a lot of active ingredients and behaviour change techniques in them, which need to be taken into account. Now, if you look at the circle surrounding the BCI scenario, you'll see that, in essence, this is the triangle that I showed you in the last slide, represented in a different way. So all of these, the mechanisms of action, the context, exposure, the intervention, and the parts of those all need to be reported, annotated, fed into the system to develop the knowledge system. And the behavior change intervention scenarios has an outcome in terms of what the behavior is, but also the value. For example, how smoking cessation has been measured over what period of time. Now, if we go to the red side of it, which is about the evaluation methods themselves, in order to understand the effect of any intervention, one not only has to understand how all the different aspects on the right-hand side are having an influence, but also what were the methods by which the effect size was generated. So we have a BCI evaluation that compares two or more scenarios to have an output at the top of the effect. Now, if you look at the left-hand side, the behavior change intervention evaluation report is about the evaluation. And from that report, we find features that have certain risks of bias. We also look at the BCI evaluation applying a method, and that method has features which also realizes risk of bias. So we have risk of bias from the way in which the study was conducted and the data were generated, and also, going back to the first part of my talk, in the way in which the intervention is reported in the published literature. So we have to put all of this together to build the knowledge system. Okay, I mentioned before the sub-ontologies that we're developing for all of these. So for every single one of the circles on the right-hand side, we're developing ontologies that are, for example, the mode of delivery. I think we have 4 or 5 levels of ontology there. And these are ontologies, not just taxonomies, because we're specifying relationships between the entities. And we hope to have these pretty well completed over the next six months. And I've got a team of 4 people working on this and annotating papers using them. Okay, so a different way of just representing the knowledge system in green, with the green dots and the green circle, is where artificial intelligence and machine learning comes in, both with the annotating of the research reports and also with the synthesis and interpretation. Okay, and I've mentioned annotation. I also mentioned we're starting with smoking cessation, with randomized controls, trials, and also with Cochrane reviews, to start off with a certain level of guaranteed quality of study. We're annotating using our preliminary ontology, checking reliability, and using the human annotation to build and train the automated system, and then revising the ontology as we do this. So we have close working relationships between the computer science team and the behavioral science team in how we're generating the data that they're then using to train the system. We are using machine learning to find optimal connections and weights to classify outputs from the input data, and reasoning algorithms using entity relationships and axioms to infer new entity relationships. And these algorithms will be trained, tested, and updated using the database and the ontology that I presented. The algorithms will query that database for features specified by the user. It will predict effect sizes for the entities that are queried, along with a confidence estimate, i.e. a machine-generated judgment of the probability that the prediction is correct. This is important. Also, and again, the thing that excites me as a behavioral scientist, to generate new insights about behavior change from the patterns of associations. And finally, again, very important, to allow an explanation of how the algorithms arrived at their conclusions and to state important caveats. So when we make recommendations, it will be in terms of confidence estimates, explanations, and caveats. Okay, now this slide is put together by James Thomas, whose email I have put on the bottom right-hand side, who's heading up our systems architect work. And so this is his current schematic of the collaborations, connected services, and data sources that he's putting together in terms of data in, data out. And just to say that we are developing good collaboration with the Cochrane and their ontology, because what we're doing is going into hugely much more depth and much more elaboration of the ontology that Cochrane has been using to date, but also Cochrane has been using ontology and beginning to automate it using the EPI reviewer on the left-hand side here, so that we can use knowledge and information that they're generating. They, in the long run, hopefully will be able to use what we produce. Anybody who wants more information about the details of this, James Thomas is your man. Okay, I mentioned that an important part of what we're doing is building an interface. This will be an online, open access, interactive interface to enable widespread use of the knowledge generated, because this is very much to be useful to solve real-world problems. The aim is for it to be an easy method for searching the behaviour change intervention literature using purpose-built syntax for fixed and open parameters, level of abstraction, etc. So going back to that big question I posed at the beginning, for some questions, there may be particular populations, for example, that are wanted. For others, it may be left open. So it's up to the user to decide what parameters they fix and what they leave open, and also what level of abstraction to use in their queries. We also want to bring user feedback from a wide perspective of views into the database and into the ontology. So this will be a very interacting, iterative process. So with the experts training the system, but the users also feeding back to refine the database and also the ontology itself. And also the interface being used not just by human beings, but other computer programs. Okay, just to remind you of this big question that I mentioned before in terms of the user interface, and also different kinds of users. But they could be practitioners, they could be basic scientists, researchers. You know, we're envisaging a really wide range of users, and we're building up as we go hundreds of people who are interested in this, and we're building up panels of different kinds of users that we hope to engage in our work as we get more developed. So do sign up if you're interested. In our published protocol, we have just given illustrations. This is quite from a UK point of view. You'll see Highways England is here on the left-hand side, or we're talking about local authorities in a deprived region of England. But on the left-hand side, we have just come up with 5 of the kind of organisations and people who we envisage are likely to be using this system, then their requirements, and we've translated that into their particular query. And these slides will be all accessible to you after this talk. So for the sake of time, I won't go into this in more detail, but you can see, I think, the huge range of types of questions that this system will be able to answer. Okay, so evaluating what we're doing, there's various ways we're planning to do this. One is looking at the adequacy, applicability, and validity of the ontology itself. Secondly, looking at iterator reliability of the manual annotation process, which we're doing currently. Then the accuracy of the automated annotator, the accuracy of predictions from the machine learning and reasoning algorithms. Then comparing what we produce from our knowledge system with existing methods of evidence synthesis. user evaluation of the system's accuracy, how relevant and salient it is for them, the extent to which they see it as valid and how useful it is to them. And finally, what new insights about behaviour change have been generated by the system. So going back to the beginning of my talk, I was really talking about the frustration, the problems of trying to make sense and trying to synthesize evidence as currently reported. One of the things we're doing is to use the ontology to develop templates for people to be able to describe their interventions right from the beginning in ontological terms. So here is just an example of a feature or some features within a behaviour change intervention ontology and how that could be reported. So what's the particular feature? We've just taken a few little examples. What's the value of that feature? Now, if we can get researchers reporting their research from the beginning, this can all go straight into machines and computers and doesn't have to come through the laborious and very inaccurate route of putting it into words and then us trying to interpret words. So this would enable clear and full reporting, massively revolutionise data synthesis, and be fantastic for this issue about interoperability, linking different ontologies from different domains to each other and extending knowledge. One of the behavioural scientists collaborators on this, Robert West, has got an associated grant to develop an ontology for the field of addiction. And he's editor of the journal Addiction and has already submitted one paper to it where the entire study has been reported in an ontology, and it's many, many pages. Now, an ontology will never really totally substitute for words, but I think the discipline of putting everything into ontology means all the information is there, and then one can use words, use the narrative, to then supplement that, to discuss background, to discuss explanations, to elaborate, to make it easier to access for humans. But the vision is that this work will change the way people report their research, the way they conduct their research, as well as the end product of all of this in trying to make sense of it and bring evidence together for solving real-world problems. So this got going last year, so we're in early stages of this. I hope over the next year we will make much more progress. But as we develop, as we begin to produce things that can be used by other researchers, we're very keen to have as much collaboration as possible. We're doing this for the field. We're going to do it as open source a way as is possible, i.e. 100%. So you really are just saying, keep an eye on the website as we develop over the next, well, we'll have another three plus years. But the kind of ideas for collaboration that have come up so far when I've been talking are applying this approach not just to research reports but to individual level data sets rather than aggregate level data that we're having to work with, and I think that's absolutely the way we have to go. Personally, I'd like to do away with journals, have everything online and basically have annotated data sets up there that we can then put together. Including cost-effectiveness evidence is something that's been raised on more than one occasion. That would be great to bring that in. As I said at the beginning, we're really doing proof of principle, starting with smoking cessation. We said in our proposal that we would also go on to alcohol, physical activity, and healthy eating. So the idea is to do those 4 areas, but really this can apply to absolutely anything. And I hope as we make progress, other people with other expertise and other interests can take a similar approach and run with it. And then again, has been raised several times, is the ethical aspects of how we can maximize social benefit and minimize harm. I mean, obviously, the more efficient and effective one makes any kind of scientific and technological exercise, the more harm can be produced as well as benefit. And there are many, many more projects and ideas, I'm sure, hopefully, in your heads as well as elsewhere. So I'm going to stop there, and I think that leaves us the amount of time that you usually have for questions and discussion. So thank you very much.
Thanks, Susan. That was fantastic. It's a really thank you for presenting that. It's a very exciting project, and that's a lot of good information. I'm going to open the floor to questions, and I will extend, of course, the right of the first question to Professor Dubé, who I'm sure has a question.
Yes, thank you, Susan. It is so visionary that I do believe that everyone on this webinar see this as an opportunity for immediate and long-term collaboration. As you know, our group here at McGill have been 2 points that I will make before asking my question. One is that we are very much interested into the underlying mechanism, biological as well as contextual, that are driving the effectiveness of intervention. And we have also been taking healthy eating in all of its facets in various applications. So with this as a background, I have kind of a multi-component question. When you have your 16 grouping of your taxonomy, that I believe is a build-up of your theoretical domains of intervention that you have been developing for many, many years. How can we move forward to have the hardcore generic science of behavior, but also looking at this within the context of the domain of application? Because it is a challenge that I think as we move toward bringing computer science capability, the combining of the generic science of behavior with the specific domain that are using it in the application. But that's the first part of my question. The second part...
Could I ask that now so I don't forget it?
Okay.
Okay, so 2 parts of the answer, or an answer. One is I have had another grant that I haven't presented here, that has been looking at bringing together, linking the behavior change techniques with their mechanisms of action.
Okay.
Because if we want to develop theory-based interventions, then we need to have a consensus about what mechanisms are changed by which behavior change techniques. And if we want to understand an evaluation theoretically, we also need to be able to do that if theory hasn't been explicitly used. So on the new Human Behaviour Change Project website, which I hope will be up in a month or 2, we will have the results of this series of studies where we've looked at the literature to see how have authors linked up behaviour change techniques with mechanisms of action. And we've also had an international consensus exercise with about 100 experts working together to come up with their views about it. And all of this is going to be represented on the website as an interactive tool, as a heat map. So for every single link between, I think we use 28 mechanisms of action and I think 60 behavior change techniques, for every cell there, you can click onto it and find out what does the literature say, what does experts say, and also it is there to foster collaboration. So you can give information, you can ask questions, and people can interact about these links. So I think that has got a real potential to help bring collaboration and advance the field. In terms of the particular domains of application, this is a really important point, because people who don't know about behaviour don't really sufficiently understand that behaviour isn't behaviour isn't behaviour. Behaviours are so different. So you mentioned about healthy eating, where most of what we're trying to do with healthy eating is to help people to self-regulate and to inhibit their behaviour, whereas if we take the set of behaviours around physical activity, we're trying to do exactly the opposite. We're trying to energise and get behaviour going. So the idea that one can just have generic principles across all behaviours is hardly ever the case, which is why we're developing an ontology of behaviours themselves, and we hope that this will be completed over this next year. I don't know if that
yeah, thank you.
Right.
Thank you very much. And I will just ask, I had ABC, I will just ask B, and then Sean, after that, you can move to the electronic floor for questions. My other question was, currently, from what I understand, the knowledge that you are processing is at the aggregate level, report of study and so on. As we move forward, and you have it in your collaboration slide at the end, how would you see moving, in particular in the context of eating, which is where we have the more differentiated fine-grained knowledge of context and so on. To what extent, how do you see moving toward both feeding the platform as well as using it in a geo reference basis, in a contextual basis, so that we get not just kind of the impact outcome, but also the actual much finer grain data that we can contribute or that we can feed in terms of asking, interrogating the platform. So that's my last question.
Okay, so we're organizing the data just in terms of the ontology that I presented, and that's not going to encompass every single aspect, for example, of context, but what we will be doing is type of population in a very, level of granularity and detail, same for the intervention setting. Now, I think of the 4 behaviours that I mentioned, I think healthy eating is the one that's the most difficult because it's so difficult to get objective data. So I think this is the one that we are likely to tackle last. So we're going to move on from, once we've made a bit more progress with smoking, we're going to look at physical activity. Then I think we'll look at alcohol reduction, and only finally healthy eating. And it may be within the 4 years we won't even get onto that. So all I can say is watch this space. But I think it's really a very challenging, the most challenging of those 4 areas.
Okay, thank you. Back to you, Sean.
Yeah, great. And I'm going to take the opportunity to ask a question before I leave it to the floor. So we've my group before, and with collaborating with Jay DePass, we've done a lot of simulation modeling, and I would say much of our simulation modeling is, so we use agent-based modeling and try to represent populations, and we've done a lot of work in disease spread and disease intervention, and one of the holy grails, I think, of especially population level agent-based modeling is to be able to actually model behavior in a real way, in a real enough way that it's not so complicated, but in a real way that it actually is meaningful to policymakers and decision makers. Have you considered the role of that, not just the type of simulation modeling that I'm talking about, but computational modeling? I imagine a lot of some of your cost-benefit work has some like things like decision analytics modeling in there and such. Have you considered the role of how modeling can connect to this and how it could be used to help enhance the work, or it can enhance the modeling efforts?
Well, I think that's a really interesting thought. I'm a huge fan of agent-based modeling without knowing very much about it. And in fact, Robert West and another colleague here at UCL, Jamie Brown, have just got a grant to do agent-based modeling with smoking cessation. So we will be working on that over the next couple of years. And also, I'm part of a National School for Public Health Research. And there's a group, I don't know if you know them, in Sheffield, Alan Brennan and others, who are doing some really interesting agent-based modeling around alcohol consumption, and using a sort of Bayesian approach to, iteratively go backwards and forwards between the modeling and real-world data. So we're actually planning to have a joint research meeting with the Sheffield group sometime in the next few months and sit on each other's advisory boards, etc. I think there's huge potential here. I haven't, and our colleagues haven't thought about how this can join in with the Human Behaviour Change project. So I think just that's a very interesting idea, and it's the sort of thing that I would hope down the line, if there's groups of people who want us to put on a webinar just to discuss particular ideas, it's something we could facilitate. So let's keep in touch on that one, because in 6 months or so we'll be further down the road in terms of agent-based modelling, and especially having done it in the same area that we're looking at in terms of the Human Behaviour Change project.
Okay, great. Yeah, and just a comment is that, I mean, it's, again, just to say this is a really nice presentation. We're here at McGill, we're also interested in the idea of putting data out there. We here at the Montreal Neurologic Institute are leading an effort called that we call Open Science, the Open Science effort, and all of our tools that we have developed, we're very focused on trying to make data sets available. Now, this is mostly in terms of like neuroimaging and such, but it's very nice to see projects that are not only just putting things out there, but also with your work on ontologies and making it useful. It's a very nice piece of work, so I just wanted to compliment you on that.
Great. And when you said the open science, is this the open science framework you're talking about?
Yeah, so yes, that's that we're currently working through that. The MNI has announced that we will be making all of our data here publicly available through Open Science, and so we're working through the issues of how do we not just put that out there, but and of course we have other issues like privacy concerns and such with the data that we have. How do we not only put it out there, but make it accessible to people in a way that doesn't violate privacy and those concerns. So it's a very interesting topic. So I just it always makes me happy to hear people struggling with putting things out there and doing it in a nice and beautiful format like you've just presented.
So we're also, as well as having the study website, we've also got a domain on the Open Science Framework. In fact, for all my main projects, I ask everybody to put it up on Open Science Framework. And if anybody who's on this webinar now doesn't know about Open Science Framework, I'd really suggest that you just Google it, look at it. It's free. It's absolutely fantastic. And it's really not that difficult to put one's projects up there. And one of the good things is that one can specify the level of privacy for the different parts of your work. So some could just be for you, or just your close collaborators. Others could be for the extended team. Others can be for the public. But the idea of sharing as much as possible as we go along has got to be the future if we're serious about advancing as quickly as possible.
Absolutely, I totally agree, and thank you for the recommendation. Appreciate it. We have a question from the chat room from Emery. Hi, I have a question about the utility of this mechanism. The ontology will be using current studies and applied theories. They all have a sort of pattern and structure, yet we are going for digital interventions which transcends the grounded theories, but using big data and just-in-time intervention techniques which cannot be utilized with the existing theories. Is the ontology will the ontology be dynamic enough to cover these details as well? The AI behind will be learning the changes in the literature and following the trajectories?
Yeah, the time dimension is a really interesting one. I mean, in our big question we put for how long, and there's different aspects of the intervention and different aspects of the effects where we can build in the time dimension. But you're absolutely right that this is an issue that's really become very high profile over the last few years as these new technologies have come about, and we're able to generate and look at the patterns of change over time in a very granular, minute-to-minute way. So there's ways in which what's in the published reports is really only a kind of top-level summary of what is going on underneath them. And so I think this is where what I said on that final slide about using the ontologies and using exactly the same approach to actual data sets rather than reports of data findings. So I think for these kind of just-in-time interventions, and which are fantastic in terms of, or the potential is fantastic in terms of generating data and insights about behavior change in real time, in real context, I think using data sets themselves is the way to go. I mean, having said that, I think there's a mismatch obviously at the moment, I think, between the potential, because we've got all the streams of data about wearables, about biomarkers, about environmental sensors, but how do you put that all together to really make sense of it in a way that can really test and develop our theories? But I've written an article on this with various people actually from the States, which is in the Journal of International Journal of Behavioral Medicine. We had a series of about 5 papers that came out of an international workshop I organized, which was about methodologies for developing and evaluating digital interventions, because I think there's a whole range of new questions that are raised by digital interventions where the old methods really don't apply. And those are actually all on the website of the Centre for Behaviour Change that I run. So they allowed us to have it open access on one site. So if any of you want those papers, either go on that site or email me and I'll send them.
Okay, great. Thanks. Are there any? If anybody else on the webinar would like to ask a question, you can either post it in the chat room, or you're welcome to unmute and ask personally. Is there anybody else that would like to ask a question? Yeah. Okay. So I will. I guess that we've had a good discussion, and I will just remind everybody that we will be having. And let me turn it over to Laurette to if Laurette would like any final words and to thank our speaker.
I can very well let you thank her. I just want since you know me, I always use everybody in time to the minute. So, Suzanne, just along the line of what you were talking about in the agent-based model, as well as your physiology, your mechanism, very, very likely we will follow up very soon with you for various reasons, including as part of our Brain to Society, or the healthy brain in healthy life. I think we are just acquiring now all the information of the UK Biobank that cover neuroimaging and so on. I think it's 10,000 of that information. So there are many facets, whether it is on the food side, how to kind of combine our current and future and past work on healthy eating so that it advances. It builds synergy with where you are currently, as well as on the side of modeling as well. We are in our international network. What Sean was talking about is population-level agent-based model that have a given type of use for simulation when you want to examine population-level phenomenon, whether it's flu or obesity or other. But we also work with TCS, and I think some of Vivek team on the behavioral at the Human Center Design team in India, TCS, are also very much doing fascinating work on what they call not piecemeal, but fine-grained agent-based model, which are really kind of building very much like you do a repository of knowledge in dividing a given behavior in various components, but then linking them with very mechanistic agent-based model at the individual level that can then feed both the update, the agent-based at the population, as well as the update on this dynamic knowledge basis that we are talking about. So I will stop here and very, very much thanking you for an excellent presentation. And I believe we have you in Montreal in May, so we will definitely take an intense follow-up to your presentation. Back to you, Sean.
Excellent.
Yeah,
Thank you.
Oh, sorry, Susan. I didn't talk over you. I would also like to thank you very much. This was a wonderful presentation. Very happy that you agreed to present to us and show us your work. Really looking forward to possibly talking to you in the future. So thank you very much.
My pleasure. It's been great to talk to you all. Yeah.
Great.
Bye-bye.
And